In conversation with Phillip Hall. Between 1987 and 2014, Philip worked as a teacher of sport in camps throughout regional NXW, Far North Queensland, and the Northern Territory. He designed sport and outdoor environment education programs designed to teach emotional resiliency, cooperative group learning, self-decision making, and respect for country. In late 2014, some unresolved mental health issue reached a crisis and he suffered a breakdown which resulted in a period of hospitalization and the end of his career. In late 2015, he retreated to Melbourne Sunshine where he could concentrate on his recovery while working as a writer. Philip has completed via external part-time studies a Doctor of Creative Art at Wollongong University, where he researched Australian poetry, contemporary plays theory, eco-criticism, and post-colonialism. And on today's episode of our interview, it's my utmost pleasure, joy, and excitement to offer the show today, Philip Hall. Welcome on the show, Philip.
Oh, thank you, Peter, for that lovely welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. I've been following your channel for a long while now. Your love for books, your passion for literature, and the videos you have on the channel, and to know you're also a poet and writer. I'm very excited, and I'm excited we're here to talk about your works, including your channel as well.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. So, Philip, you write a confessional style of poetry. And to me, I need to say this is something quite exceptional as we have two different types of poetry. And I wanted to ask you, how did you come to adopt this style of writing? What do you think are its strengths and weaknesses? Do you sometimes worry that in writing confessional poetry, you're exposing too much of yourself? I think it's a nice way to start a conversation with poetry. Let's get into it. Love your
Sure.
take on that.
Yeah, it's a pickle, isn't it? If you want to write poetry, you have to have a poetics, a system behind you to help you explore. And in modern poetry, there are so many systems, ways of writing, ways of approaching the task.
Yeah.
When I first started writing poetry, I was actually writing poetry of place. And my
Oh.
poetry was very much informed by eco-criticism and post-colonialism. So I was really interested in writing about different places in the Australian context that was really informed by that green politics and by, as I said, post-colonialism. I've always been really interested in first Australian culture with first Australian friends and working with first Australian teenagers. That, a lot of the work I did running big outdoor education and sport
Mm.
programs was actually first Australians. So when I started this journey with poetry, I was actually a poet of place. That's what I was known for. And my first book, probably my first two books, really, were both really poetry of place, informed by that green politics and by post-colonialism. In late 2014, I had a really big breakdown,
Wow.
and I ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a month or so. And that's when the confessional poetic really crashed in.
Wow.
And after that, I've sort of now got stuck with the confessional poetic, and I love it. I think it has a lot of strengths. It has some weaknesses as well. The main one is what you just said.
Mm.
Confessional poetry can be very exposing.
Yeah.
Um, and I have written a lot of poems that I find very difficult, if not impossible, to read publicly. And it's funny to think that you've written these poems and you can't actually read them in public without breaking down in tears. But anyway, yeah, so yes, I do worry that sometimes it's very exposing, but I think I love poetry so much, and poetry, my reading and writing, now that I've lost my career as an outdoor educator, I now
Mm.
live off my reading and writing. I write essays, reviews, and poetry. Um, so and confessionalism is what I've sort of now become known for. My last book, Cactus, is all a
Wow.
book of confessional poetry.
Oh, that's quite amazing to know, really. And I enjoy listening to you talk about that because as a poet myself, and I can understand that we have two different types. We have people who write in the conventional style of poetry, and we have those who write in the free verse, in the most modern style, where you can explore free verses yourself. You can write it anyhow. You can do the stanzas in a different way you want to without it relating to, say, meter, rhythm, personification, a whole lot of those qualities that poetry ought to possess. And we have others going the confessional way style, which I think to me it's more like the old style of writing, the foundational style of writing compared to the modern, the current, the 21st century style of writing poetry, or the modern, the current style, stuff like that. I think, and the actually discussion also on the theme of which is better to write in, which are some of the best way to write poetry. Should it be the conventional style or the current style, the current modern style of writing? And the discussion on it, which one is well acceptable, which one draws readers in the most. And I think this actually, again, differs from poet to poet because some people might be so talented at writing in the conventional style, or we have others talented in writing in the modern style of poetry. So it's an amazing discussion, and I love your take on that, really.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I guess confessional poetry really got off the ground in the United States in the sort of
Yeah,
mid 20th century.
yeah.
And there were poets like, Robert Lowell, W.D. Snodgrass, John
Mm,
Berryman, and then of course, there was the great Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, and of course Denise Levertov. It really got off the ground in the middle 20th century, I guess. And I guess now, confessional poetry, I guess now is probably one of the dominant strains of contemporary poetry. Coming right forward to the 21st century. My own poetics, I guess I blend the two things, the two styles that you were just talking about. So
yeah,
while I confessional poetry, I do free the poet up. I like to breathe a lot of air into my lines, and I like to scatter my lines across the page. I don't use rhyme or meter. I use a lot of, sound. There's a lot of alliteration within each line. So I really do I hope I have an ear for the rhythm of, the fall, the rise and fall of those syllables. But no, my poetry is very much, there's an American poet, Archie Emmons or A.R. Emmons.
yeah,
He's a poet who had a really big impact on me. He was a real poet of place, very much
yeah.
informed again by green politics. And I love his prosody, the way he scatters the line across the page and really breathes that air into the lines. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I love your take on that. And most of this conventional style could be found in the Poetry Foundation magazine. I follow them a lot. And once they have a particular poet published with their poems, I always love to read them. And are very, very beautiful. Very beautiful. Quite amazing. Thank you for sharing. I love your take on that. And now I would like us to diverse a bit to your book, the one titled Fume. I wanted to ask you how
Yeah,
the book came to be and what are the kind of the themes would experience reading it. Beautiful cover
this
you've
one.
got in there.
Yes. Look, I was really lucky. My dream, as I said, for the last 30 years, I've been an outdoor educator, designing really big sport and camping programs for teenagers.
Mm,
Um, and my really big dream was always to go to remote Australia and work with first Australian teenagers.
wow.
So about 10 years ago, when my all my kids were left home and they were all, young adults finding their own way in the world. So that was my time to do it. So in 2010, I think it was. I was able to head up to the Northern Territory, right up into Australia's Gulf of Carpentaria, right up into the top end of Northern Australia. And I was able to work in a town, a very remote town called Borroloola.
Wow.
Borroloola was so remote, it was literally 800 kilometers from the closest hairdresser.
Wow.
It was a very small town of first Australians, and I was able to go there for 5 years and work with first Australian teenagers running these big sport and camping programs.
Mm,
And Fume is all about my experience doing that work.
mm,
So I was really lucky. I was welcomed into Gudanji family and culture. So I was taken out bush and sung into a custodian relationship to special sites and places within the bush in Borroloola.
mm.
So I had, and then I was often taken out bush on camping trips. And, this is what wasn't when I was at work. This was for my free time. I would go out with family and I would be doing work with the
Wow.
remote families. And so this book is very much a celebration of the work that I was doing, the sport and camp programs I was designing, the teenagers that I was getting to know. But it's also a real celebration of first Australian culture, family ties in that top end environment.
Interesting. I love your take on that. That sounds to be quite amazing, really. And I would like you to read a section of it much later on. That'll be very nice.
Sure.
Now, I wanted to go to the conversation of suicide. As a suicide survivor who often write about the struggle of living with major depression and PTSD, do you think that writing can become part of the healing process? Can it help others who suffer from similar anxieties? I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, look, I hope so. I think you have to be very careful. The list of poets that I just gave you, those six poets who I think really started this confessional poetic in the mid 20th century in the United States. Several of those six poets did end up passing away by suicide. Of
Wow.
course, Sylvia most famously, but John Berryman and Sexton, they all passed away from suicide.
Wow.
Think you have to be very careful, don't you? Gazing into the abyss can be healthy, and it can be a way of healing, and sharing what you're going through maybe can be a way of destigmatizing mental health and helping other people. So I hope it does that. But I am aware that you also do need to be very careful. It can become very self-indulgent, and it can help, it can encourage you maybe to even go too much into that abyss and to go into places that aren't always healthy. So I think you have to be careful. But I guess, everybody's different. And I couldn't live now without writing poetry. So in a sense, I'm now stuck with the confessional poetic. And I do love it. I love confessional poetry. I love writing it and sharing that journey. It is very raw. But yes, I am aware that you have to be careful.
Yeah, I
There are a
understand.
lot of,
I love your take on that, really. And I wanted to add to one of the things you mentioned, because to me, as a poet, as a fellow poet, writing or poetry to me sounds like a therapeutic journey. I can remember my first start into poetry. I even had no idea what I was doing back then. I knew that whenever I feel a bit depressed or sad or, where I lived back then many years ago, I would go into my room and shed a couple tears and bring out my pen and the write-up and the paper, rather a book. Then I write some things down. I had no idea what I was doing back then. I just realized that once I wrote down those experiences, it could be a few paragraphs, I would feel relieved for the day, then I'll keep it. And if I add a similar again, the next day, the third day, I keep doing it over and over again. So it seemed as if I was keeping a journal. I had no idea what actually it is. Then over the time, I started sharing some of those write-up on Facebook. And people were like, wow, that's very deep. That's amazing. That's beautiful. Then later on, somebody was like, this is great. You should publish a book. I was like, oh, a book? Really? So then I had to go and message a friend of mine back then. This is many years ago. Back then in high school, though she entered the university, she's well known as a writer. Then I sent her a copy and said, please, what is this actually I'm doing? What kind of thing would you classify this? Then she said, well, this is an article, this is poetry. I was like, oh, really? So I'm writing poem. So literally, I started all of these things blank with no idea what I was doing. I had no idea it's called poetry. Well, I know poetry. Back then, I understand I read a couple poems, but then I couldn't really recollect that this is what exactly I'm doing. So it's more like a very
yeah,
therapeutic journey to me. It's very, very, all of this emotion, I invoke them in my writing. And sometimes people ask me, your book, Fifty Legend of Doom is extremely sad. I hope you went suicide at some point. I'll be like, well, at some point I feel extremely depressed. And, writing these words just feel like a relief, like a comfort, like it gives me easiness. And I can relate really. It's so sad hearing to know about, the man you mentioned who died of suicide, despite, being a writer. It's a whole lot. Works like the likes of Allen Poe, who always writes some terrible, terrible hard works. based on his experiences as well. Poetry is a whole lot. One of the reasons why I love to consider it the language of the soul of the poet at that particular time that the poem is written. Love your take. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I also wanted to ask you, what can you tell us about the history of confessional poetry and its place in the world of contemporary poetry? I'd love your take on
It's
that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I think it really got off the ground in that, as I was saying before, in that mid 20th century American milieu. I really do think, one of the first guys, I guess, was Robert Lowell. He spent a lot of time in and out of psychiatric hospitals. He apparently was born into the United States real gentry, the aristocratic type class. Very, very wealthy family, the Lowells apparently. And he had serious psychiatric problems. How he
Wow.
was in and out of hospital, and he was one of the first guys, I suppose, who really started to shine that light on himself and realized that what was happening in his subconscious really was something worth writing about. That you didn't have to only write about what was happening out there in the real world, but you could focus on that subconscious and write about what was happening in your own mental state. And I
Mhm.
think in that post World War II environment, with the Holocaust and the complete devastation of World War One, World War II, the Great Depression between the two world wars, um, and then, you had the beginnings of continental philosophy with existentialism and phenomenology. And then, of course, James Joyce with the great Ulysses and, this whole stream of consciousness, which was then
Yeah.
really taken up by people like Virginia Woolf, Clarice Lispector, and,
Mm.
of course, Joyce himself. And so writers were turning more and more to stream of consciousness, to trying to capture that internal headspace. And for some reason, it took the poets 20 years to catch up. But eventually, just after World War II, people like Lowell, Berryman, Snodgrass, Plath, Levertov,
Mm.
Sexton, with these sort of people, they really started to turn the spotlight back on themselves and realize that their stream of consciousness, their headspace was something which deserved to be focused on and written about. And
Yeah.
maybe, that had something that other people might be interested in.
Absolutely. Oh, wow. That's very beautiful. Quite amazing. And I love your take on that. I love your take. This is very amazing, really. I love your answers to these questions. Yeah, I love your
Thank you.
answers to these questions. And I'd like us to go now into your other book in the name of Cactus. Yeah, I'd like you to tell us about what inspired you to write that too. You have amazing covers. They're very simple and so calm. And I love the look of the horse face in there.
Yes, I was really lucky with this. And my current publisher is Recent Work Press. Shane Strange in Canberra in Australia. He does the best covers in Australian poetry, I think. So I'm really lucky that he's publishing this. This is one of his covers for me. It's a
Wow.
picture of a greyhound, of course. Um, this book. Oh boy. This book, as I said, I had that really big breakdown. About 25 years ago, I suffered three bereavements in a 12-month period.
Oh, good
I
God.
lost a baby and both of my younger brothers in
Oh,
accidents. And one of my brothers, he died in the bush. He had a fall over a cliff, and I was left with him at the bottom of the cliff when we got down to him. I was left with him while other people went to get help, and I was left with my brother for several hours, and he literally died in my lap while we were waiting for the helicopter rescue. And maybe like a lot of men, my partner at the time, she begged me to get help, to go to a grief counselor to deal with what was going on. She could see that I had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And maybe like a lot of men, I don't know whether it's only men, I don't know. But I found it very difficult. At the time, I was a young man. I had four young kids. I was working full time, trying to hold everything together. And the first, as soon as you enter a grief counselor, psychiatrist, of course, what they wanted you to do was to relive the moments. Um, and for me at the time, it was just too much. I wanted to forget about it. And so I just buried everything into work, overwork. I just became for 30 years a chronic overworker. Um, that seemed to be an easier way of dealing with the problem. And then, of course, all I did was make things get much worse ultimately. So in late 2014, I had a really big breakdown and a suicide attempt. And I ended up being airlifted to Darwin Hospital from Borroloola, where I was working with those First Australian community. I ended up in Darwin Hospital for a couple of days, and then I was transferred to the psychiatric hospital where I spent the best part of a month. And that was the end of my career.
Wow.
I was told then that I would have to have a much quieter, much more gentle life, and I would have to be committed to recovery and seeing doctors and all that sort of thing.
Mm.
So I returned home to Melbourne, where I was living at the time. I went back to Melbourne to get the proper medical help that I obviously needed. And this book was completely written in that climate. So I started writing this book, I suppose, in probably 2015 when I was living in Melbourne full time after my big breakdown. I was getting help, so I was feeling a little bit stronger. I was at home full time reading and writing. So, I had all day with nothing to do but to write. So I started writing this book. And Melbourne is the capital, one of the capital cities of Australia. It's a fantastic city of about 4 million people.
Wow.
And it really is the arts capital of Australia. It has fantastic museums and art galleries and libraries and just incredible. So I spent a lot of time, going to the Melbourne cricket ground to watch the Australian football
Oh.
and to watch cricket. And then, of course, I spent a lot of time going to art galleries and concert halls. So this book, Cactus, is all about that. It's about me waking up in my little townhouse, walking to the station. Because one of the things I immediately did when I had my breakdown was to stop driving to, again, try and take some pressure off myself. So I
Mm.
would just catch the train into Melbourne and go to the concert or go to, the cricket or the footy or the art galleries. And so this book is very much about all of those sorts of experiences. I wrote this book, I guess, between about 2015 and I think it was published in 2021. So I would have finished writing it in around 2020 and then 12 months through that editing process before it was published. Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot imbibed in Cactus. And that's a very sad story you shared with us concerning the bereavement you had to go through. I'm so sorry to know about that. I can imagine how that would feel, having your brother die in your lap. It's a whole lot of, oh no, that's a lot of experience, really, to be frankly speaking. So sorry to know, but it's a whole lot, really. And thank you for sharing with us the
Yeah.
themes, the
Stuff
main
happens, doesn't it? I
part.
guess, I'm an old person, so stuff happens. We've
Yeah,
all had
yeah,
things happen in our lives, haven't we?
you know.
But yeah, that was my story, or
Yeah,
part of
yeah.
it.
And I like us to talk about readers' feedbacks, yeah? And because one of the most interesting thing to me as a writer is to listen to readers' feedbacks. And you want to agree with me that one of the things that makes poetry to be complex is the fact that it can be interpreted in different ways by different readers based on their opinions. And sometimes the readers might get the message intended by the author. Sometimes they might be close to getting the message. Sometimes they might be far from getting the message. And sometimes they might hilariously misunderstand the message and interpret the book upside down. As interestingly fun as they sound, I would like to ask you, how do you feel when readers interpret your poetry differently than you want to intend it? How does that make you feel?
It does make you giggle at times, doesn't it?
It does.
Ultimately, though, I don't mind either because I have become, after my breakdown, when my career as an outdoor educator finished, I have become very ambitious for my writing. I really do identify now as a writer and I write for publication. So I do understand that if you are writing for publication, you're not writing for yourself. You're
Yeah,
sending it out there to the world. And so, once the poem or the essay or the review, whatever it is that you've written, once it's published, you are giving it to other people. And I guess I do agree with that criticism that suggests that, when a reader is reading a poem, they are responsible for at least 50% of the meaning, of making meaning out of that text. So
yeah.
as the author of the poem, I think you do lose 50% of that authorship, and that goes to the reader. And, if people come up with other ways of interpreting or thinking about my text, I think that's fine. I'm sure it would make me giggle a little bit. No one likes to read a bad review of their work, of course. But I've been really lucky, actually. Nearly all my reviews have been really promising and really generous and kind, and so I've been lucky with that as well.
That's interesting. That's amazing. That's amazing because I know with poetry, it always differs with readers interpreting it based on their own perception, their own interpretation of what they think the lines seek to convey, what they think the stanzas seem to convey, and from one reader to another, it can always differ from person to a person. It differs because they just kind of interpret it based on their own understanding. I love your take on that. And
Yeah.
sometimes the interpretation can just makes you laugh and smile and giggle, like you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky too. A lot of my poetry is quite narrative. I
Mm.
never knew I was a good storyteller. But yeah, as I've started to write more and more poetry, my poetry is actually becoming more and more narrative in
Wow.
style. So that means that often my poetry isn't as difficult to confuse its meaning either, because on one level it is telling a story. Sometimes with a little bit of clever humor, I hope. But
Wow.
yeah, a lot of my poetry is quite narrative based, as it's dealing with, my own mental state and that subconscious stuff. So, um,
Thank you. Thank you. Now, how would you describe your system of poetics? Also, in your own word, how would you define poetry? What does poetry means to you?
ooh, wow. One of the things poetry means to me is it really is poetry to the rescue. I
Mm.
was just so lucky, and I do know how lucky I am. There are very few people who can turn their hobby into their job, and I've been
Yeah.
really, really lucky. When I had that breakdown, that could have um, it really could have made things very difficult for me. And I was just lucky that as I had my breakdown, I was already writing. I had already published my first book. My first book is this one called Sweetened in Coals, which is now out of print. And I published this, probably 15, 20 years ago, so a long time ago.
Wow.
It's been out of print for quite a while. This is a book totally of place-based poetry.
Oh, wow.
Um, Yeah, but when I had my breakdown, I was just really lucky that I started to get a bit of a name with some of the university literary journals in Australia, and I wrote a couple of reviews and they liked them, so then they wanted me to write more. So just as I had that big breakdown, and I found myself at home with nothing to do, but also with no income,
Wow.
my writing took off. So I was just really lucky. From 2015, I've now, I live off my writing reviews. I review not only poetry, I review works of philosophy, novels,
Mm.
non-fiction, biography, memoir, all sorts of things.
Wow.
And I used to review also exhibitions at art galleries and concerts at the
Oh,
concert, like the Melbourne Symphony. I don't do that anymore now because I've adopted my Billy Blue, a greyhound. I've
wow.
adopted a rescue greyhound, the love of my life. So I don't go anywhere anymore. I can't take him. So now all of my work is based from home. So all my reviewing now is book reviewing. But then I write essays, and I also, of course, publish a lot of poetry. I should have a new book come out hopefully late this year. It might be early next year, but we will see.
That's amazing. I love your take in that. That's quite beautiful. That's quite beautiful. And I love your definition of poetry too. It sounds quite great to me. Thank you for letting us know.
Poetry to the rescue.
It's a
It's a hard
rescue.
thing to define, isn't it? Like, to some extent, some people argue that the definition of poetry is simply, it's a line that doesn't get to the edge of the page.
Yeah,
But then, of course, you have prose poetry, so then that blows that out of the water as well.
absolutely. And I think everybody can actually define poetry should not have a particular definition. It should not have a particular single definition. To my own perception, I think everybody knows or has something in their mind that poetry means to you. To you, it's the rescue.
Exactly.
So I think every poet should have their own definition of what poetry means. So poetry should not have a particular single definition. To me, I love to consider it the language of the soul of the writer at that particular time that a poem is written. And sometimes the language might convey sadness depending on when it was written. Sometimes it might convey happiness. Sometimes it could convey heartbrokenness. Sometimes it could convey joy. Sometimes it could convey grief. Sometimes it could convey, justice. Sometimes it could convey so many other things, at a particular, that's why I love to add a time to it. the language of
Yeah.
the soul of the writer or of the poet at that particular time that the particular poem is written. So I think poetry should have a particular different definition from person to person. It's a relief. It's just amazing. It's amazing. And it's life-saving as
Yes, I
well.
like that way of looking at it.
It's always fun to talk about poetry, especially when you're speaking to a fellow poet.
Sorry.
I said it's always fun to talk about poetry, especially when you're speaking to a fellow poet.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's nothing better, is there? There's nothing better than a conversation about poetry.
Thank you. Now, apart from Fume and Cactus, do you have any other works you've authored or say currently working on?
Yeah, well, as I said, this was actually my first book, Sweetened in Coals.
Oh,
This is a book of place-based poetry. This is really set. A lot of this stuff is on the camping trips I used to take teenagers on. So I
wow.
used to take kids in the bush into the Blue Mountains and places like that for up to 2 weeks at a time. So a lot of this poetry is really in praise of beautiful scenic places in Australia. But yeah, my new collection that I'm currently writing an autobiographical verse novel to be called
Wow.
Hounded.
Wow.
And Hounded really going back. Um, I finally, at the age of 60, I finally thought that I'm actually old enough to confront head on those three bereavements that I had. So Hounded is actually going right back to that 12-month period where I lost my two brothers and that baby. Um, and it's starting with those three bereavements, and the way I dealt or didn't deal with it, and coming forward, to that breakdown I eventually had in 2014 with all those unresolved issues around PTSD and stuff. And where I'm living now. And Hounded is also, so to some extent, it's an autobiographical verse novel, really informed by confessionalism. It is going to be very fraught. There are a lot of tears. There is a lot of angst and heartbreak in this book. But the book is also, as I said, I've just adopted. About 5 years ago, I was really close to another suicide attempt. I
Wow.
had been in and out of another psychiatric hospital in Melbourne, and I was very close. And my partner at the time realized that something had to give. And I was just so lucky. My partner got me a dog. She was able to get to a greyhound rescue agency of racing dogs. And with all the medical documentation about my problems, she was able to get me a dog. And they matched me with a beautiful dog that was really affectionate and quiet
Oh,
and
wow.
gentle. And this dog came into my life, and within 2 weeks, I was a different person, Peter. That's unbelievable. People at the gym even said I smelt differently, believe it or
Oh,
not.
wow.
Apparently, I had a stench of depression.
Oh,
And this
wow.
dog, and I still live with him today. He just turned 10, and I'm hoping I've got another couple of years with him. He's a
Wow.
beautiful dog, so gentle and quiet. So Hounded is, as well as all the tears and heartbreak, Hounded is also turning into a bit of a love letter to my Billy Blue. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, there is a lot of resilience, a lot of love in it as well, particularly my relationship with this dog.
Wow. That's
Yeah, so Hounded will come out sometime late this year.
wow, that's so good. That's so nice and so fun to know.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited
I
about it.
love the excitement talking about the dog, right? It's beautiful.
Oh,
Its
yeah.
presence is quite significant, I see.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm really lucky. I've got two little grandkids now too, so I shouldn't say he's the
Oh,
only love of my life because I've got,
oh
my kids and
wow.
I've got two grandkids, which I just love to bits. But yes, Billy is certainly one of the loves of my life.
Wow.
And the odd thing is, he looks a bit like a greyhound, but he's a beautiful dog.
Oh my goodness. Pets are so fun. Dogs are quite amazing. Human friend they are, really. Thank
Oh,
you.
yeah, it's just such unconditional love you get from a dog. He just loves me every single moment of every day. He's just looking for me. He never wants to be separated from me.
Wow.
Just magnificent. He's been so good for me.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Before we round up for today, I'd like you to read a couple poem. It could be from any of your books or both, yeah. I don't know if you like to recite, so just we can see what I have an idea of what your poetry looks like. That'll be fun.
Sure. It was set, as I said before, up in the top end of Australia, so it's very hot tropical heat.
Yeah.
This is a poem. This is actually a sad poem. This is something that happened within the first fortnight of me moving to Borroloola.
Oh.
Outside my house, there was a big power pole, and one of the kids, a teenager, on ganja or marijuana. Um, for some reason, he was high on marijuana and was doing his nana, shouting and screaming. Obviously, he had a lot of problems. The poor kid. Pole. This is a real incident that happened within my first fortnight of moving to Borroloola. It was quite an introduction. Very heartbreaking. Very heartbreaking. But this is a poem about that particular experience.
Oh.
It's called Borroloola Blue. All around our steel homes, broad, bull-nosed veranda, weed jackhammered rock, dug garden beds and ponds, fenced an oasis as we planned for shade, blossoms, wildlife and fruit. Amongst the natives we frangipanis, mangoes, bananas. Security lights drew tree frogs and geckos. A Greek chorus of bellowed croaks and clicking chick-chacks. An agile profusion alternating with contentment and strife.
Hmm.
But that season, in the build-up to the wet, it was the raucous rocket frogs, ratchet-like croakings we noticed most. Each night the males made our ponds throb with their rapid yapping calls, withdrawing at sunrise when grass finches postured on the lips of ponds, flicking their tails and singing a series of squeezed rasping notes. White-gaped honey-eaters threaded a path through foliage and blossom as Papuan cuckoo shrikes tore pawpaws and mangoes. Then one night at the build-ups as we drank Chardonnay on ice, Yanyuwa youths run a manja, throwing stones and chiaking at our padlocked gates.
Oh.
It only ended when Sorry Name leapt on our fence, screaming at stars before lightly climbing a power pole like a cabbage tree palm, an unabashed athleticism, electrified
Hmm.
in the fall.
Oh, wow. I love your performance. That was quite beautiful. I would love to have another one. If you have another one you would love to recite, that would be very great. I love your performance. I love the depth of your words. I love the expression as well. I love the hand movement as well. And I love the depth of your lyrics and stanzas. They sound quite great to me. I've watched this countless time on your show, on your channel, and I'm gonna have to leave a link. I'll leave a link in the description part in case other people
That
would
would
love to
be
follow.
lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. But then to see you now perform it on P English Literature, it's quite exciting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Let's,
Yes, I do love reading my
yeah, let's
poetry.
have another one, really. Thank
All
you.
right. Well, this is a poem called Bacchus in Ruins. This is a completely different sort of poem. This is a
Yeah.
poem, actually, I've never been to London, but this is a poem set in London.
Oh.
I've only been there imaginatively, vicariously. But this is a poem set in London. Apparently, in World War II, when the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, were bombing London, on one of the bomb sites, this is a true story, it exposed, underneath all the rubble of this bomb, it
Mm.
exposed an ancient Roman temple. And when the archaeologists came in to start doing work on this temple, and they realized that the temple was originally dedicated to the Persian god Mithras, but it was later rededicated to the crowd favorite Bacchus, or Dionysus, of course, in Greek.
Yeah.
So this is a poem about this particular temple that was uncovered by the German Luftwaffe during World War II.
Yeah.
Um, Bacchus in ruins, and it begins with a quote from Ecclesiastes from the Hebrew Bible. As meals are made for laughter, so wine gives joy to life, but indiscretion sprouts wings. I love that. It's so sly and comic. I have a problem with grog, so that's another reason why I have written about Dionysus or Bacchus. I have used a lot of grog to help me deal with my post-traumatic stress disorder. I am being seeing doctors about that, so it's okay. Bacchus in ruins. The Luftwaffe exposed Bacchus beneath rubble, twice born of fire and nursed in rain, a liberated, fluid boundary, lounged in disarray. The grace of Bacchus is our release into pleasure, where prayers to a fennel staff topped with a pine cone might adjust, unshackled abandon and sadness. In drinking wine, we drink him, wrote Euripides in the Bacchae. But in this contest to be the one true vine, I have drowned in fundamentalism, rushing to rub myself out, to empty cask and glass in the mirror of precepts, to thine own self be true. I am sour-sob weeded shit, sniffed on unwashed fingers, and I thirst to gape camel-like at hubris and catastrophe. Ah, I resent every day, surrendered to moderation, the guttural groaning that celebrates order, a life denuded of ecstasy and defeat. I am fallen, not to revelry, but to self hatred, lust for transcendence, and my appeal for guilt free suicide is the poured libation of metastasis with treatment denied. Nevertheless, I still love all those suburban honey eaters under clear blue spring rich skies, but even in sunshine, my worth is shrouded and I'm stuck self medicating against
Wow.
the blue.
This is amazing. This is mind blowing. This is wholesome. This is exceptional. This is
Oh,
great.
thank you, Peter.
This is fantastic. This is extremely poetic. And I love this wholeheartedly. I love it wholeheartedly. Thank you so
Yes,
much for the invitation. It takes a lot
I
to
love poetry.
enjoy it
Yeah.
thoroughly.
People always ask, don't they? Because you write poetry too. People always ask, why poetry? It seems like such a quirky, whimsical, outdated thing to give a life to. But I have no choice. I just love
Working
poetry.
Mexico dated. That was so funny.
Yeah.
I love your take on that. And just in case we have some viewers who are watching this interview and would love to get a copy of any of your books, on what platforms are they available on for purchase?
I'm pretty sure I sent the links to you
Yeah.
on the original biography I sent you. This work, Cactus, is by Recent Work Press, and you can buy that online. And then this book, Fume, you can also buy online at the University of Western Australia Publishing. But I think if I haven't sent you the links, I
I,
can
I
send you the
did. I
links.
received it. Yeah. I received
Yes,
it.
yes. So
And
the links are there to buy these books.
absolutely. And I
And as
love
I
to
said,
link.
unfortunately, my first book has been long out of print, so you can't get that one.
Oh,
Have to
okay.
wait for it selected.
Yeah, and I left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Philip Hall books directly. And also, I left a link to his social media pages and his YouTube channel as well for possible followings. So, thank you so much, Philip, for accepting the invitation to be featured on P English Literature. And mostly, this is more than awesome. Very good, quite exciting having this lovely conversation with you around your works, around your poems, and around your beautiful recitation. Thank you so much for coming on. This is thoroughly enjoyable.
Oh, thank you, Peter. It was an absolute joy. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure as well.